Okay, so last week, thank you for getting in here. Last week, what did we go over?
I don't even have one.
I don't know what she said either.
Okay. So I forgot handouts for everybody. I attached them to the bulletin. You already got a bulletin. Good job. Do you have a bulletin?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. If I just gave this to everybody, I thought it would be good. What did we go over last week? Honesty, right? What are we going to go over this week? Dating. Dating is so much fun, right?
Yeah.
Okay, real quick before we get going. I want you guys to tell me, no it's not, is it? It's actually a horrible, gut-wrenching, painful process oftentimes. But we're not going to talk about the bad times. Tell me real quick, guys, what is dating supposed to look like, just based on what you have seen in your life? Just what is dating supposed to look like?
I want to say leading toward a godly marriage.
Okay, somebody's been reading ahead maybe?
Yeah.
No. All right, that's the right answer. But what does dating look like just whenever you have seen people dating, what you think dating is supposed to be before you go into this study? You don't have to give me the right answers that coincide with everything that the Bible says right now. Just what do you think dating looks like? Not necessarily in what you're gunning for, but in what everyone is doing.
A lot of people date like long term and go on dates and stuff and then move in together and then get married. Like,
Okay, so we have a lot of people putting the cart before the horse, right?
yeah.
Okay. Not just in moving in together, but in other ways as well. All right, what else? When are you supposed to start dating? Not you specifically. I'm sad your dad didn't come in here. He was supposed to come in here about that. Thought that'd be a good joke. When are you supposed to start dating, though? Not you specifically, but when is a person supposed to start dating? Okay?
Whenever they're ready.
All right, that's an excellent non-answer. Jacob, this is the last one in the door. When is a person supposed to start dating today in the world?
When is a person supposed to start dating?
Mm-hmm.
The world's opinion on it?
Yeah.
Just kind of whenever they feel ready, I guess.
He must have heard you whenever you came in. All right.
What?
There's no, Devin just said something
There's
really
no
similar
real
to that.
definition for that.
There's nothing out there where people are like, all right, I'm 15 years old, I get to start dating. I'm 16, now I can finally start dating. People just jump in and start dating whenever. And I will tell you my experience from all the way back in the early 2000s. So we were dating whenever we were like in 3rd grade and then 5th grade. We were having like pretend marriage ceremonies out on the basketball court at recess and stuff like that. And then gradually we worked our way into middle school as some of us didn't fail and have to stay behind. And in middle school, we actually started dating, and what was serious a little bit more, where we weren't getting married on the court at recess and stuff like that. And then it progressed up into high school, and people were dating all through high school. And the entire time, you know what no one was really worried about? Marriage. Which, in hindsight, you're like, well, yeah, why would they be thinking about marriage whenever they're 12 years old? But people were still dating at 12 years old. Let me ask you this. This is a really important question. What is the purpose of dating if you remove marriage from the equation?
Sin.
Okay, it can be sin. It's not the direction I was going, but you're right. It's entertainment, right? It's something to keep you busy. It's a companion to go through life with for a short while. But if marriage isn't in the picture, what you're doing is you're taking the intimacy that you should have in God's plan for marriage, and you're replacing it with something different, with something that will never ever be quite the same. But you're trying to have what you don't actually have the right to have at that point. Does that make sense? I'm gonna tell you guys something, and I don't know if people would normally tell you this, but I feel like you guys should have access to this information. You will not know your spouse as intimately before you were married as you will after you were married. That might seem silly, but I think we need to get that through our skulls, because everybody, whenever they're younger, especially if they've grown up in a Disney culture like I have and some of you have, you think, I'm just going to see that guy and I'm going to love him and he's going to love me and everything's going to be perfect and we're going to get married and we're going to sail right off into the sunset in a horse-drawn carriage, and everything's going to be just apple pie and all kinds of fun stuff after that. And it's not. It's really not. I'm not trying to like Debbie Downer your hopes for a marriage someday, but whenever you get married to someone, you're going to learn things about that person that you did not know before, which is fine. That's the way it's supposed to be. I'm going to tell you guys this too. We need to get the Disney idea of dating and marriage and just completely forget it. Like, try to scrub that out of our memories, because that is not how marriage is supposed to go. A prince shouldn't just walk up to a sleeping girl in the woods, kiss her, and then run off and marry her just based on the fact that they kissed and that was true love's kiss, right? Let me point this out to you. Whenever you go back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who had the least marriage trouble? Here's a hint. It's my favorite one out of the three.
I'm gonna guess Abraham.
No. Isaac, right? So you think it's Abraham because Abraham has his name out there more than Isaac. Isaac only has actually a short section in Genesis, and I really think it's because he had the least drama in his life. I mean, if you look at Abraham, he had all that stuff with his handmaiden, and having a son with his handmaiden, and then his wife had a son, and then they couldn't get along. You skip ahead to Jacob, he had 2 wives and 2 handmaidens, 2 concubines, and they all didn't get along. He had favorites. His kids tried to murder his favorite kid because they were jealous that his favorite kid was his favorite kid. And it all boiled down to the fact that he had more than one wife, essentially. You could boil it back down to polygamy. But Isaac only had 1 wife. Do you remember how they met? Do they hold hands together and walk around the courtyard and talk to each other and get to know each other's most intimate secrets before they were married? No? How can we say that? How do we know? All right, just to recap, we're going to get there in like several weeks in Genesis, but Rebecca had never met Isaac before. Isaac never met Rebecca. They didn't know each other from Adam, right? No clue who the other person was. But they had the most successful marriage out of those 3 big hitters, if you want to call them that, in Genesis, because they were dedicated to loving each other. So you need to take the Disney idea of marriage and just trash that completely, because you are not going to find a prince that rides in on a horse in shining armor that spears the dragon and then carries you off into the sunset, and your marriage is perfect after that. What you can do is approach your marriage with a godly person with a servant's attitude. The same attitude you should have in everything, a Christian attitude, and Christ was, was a servant. You should approach your marriage with that same attitude. And then, 4 years down the road, whenever you guys don't have the exact same relationship that you had whenever you were first dating or first married, instead of going, I'm not happy anymore, I want out of this marriage, you will be happy because you are still serving God with that person and helping serve that person as their spouse, either a husband or a wife. If you approach marriage with a servant's attitude, it will go so much smoother down the road than it will if you go into it asking, what can I get out of this? I have this checklist of things I want in marriage, and this person manages to meet those for now. Well, what happens if they can't meet that checklist down the road? Then you decide to trash them and get somebody else, or you have to stay with them and be miserable. But if you have a servant's attitude, then you don't have to worry about that. So, now to the checklist if we have time to get through the whole thing. I made you guys another list. I hope you guys are like filing these away in your memory or like keeping them in a scrapbook or something where you can go back over them down the road. But right off the bat, this is one of my favorite verses. Somebody read the verse at the top for us.
And whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him.
Okay, let me ask you guys this. Whenever you think about dating, do you think about it in a sense of, can I do this and be pleasing to God? And since nobody's willing to answer that, I'll tell you this. Whenever I was all of your ages, well, I was married when you guys, I was your guys' age, but for everybody else in the room, whenever I was your guys' age, this was not at the top of my checklist. Like, it didn't even click that that was something that needed to be thought about, because I didn't have that in the forefront of my mind. But if you keep it in the forefront of your mind, all of a sudden, it puts the relationship in a completely different light. So that kind of brings us to number one. Whether you're single or you're dating, doesn't matter whichever one, make sure that you're living for God. So if you remember back in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, a couple of you guys I think were in my Corinthians class when I taught Corinthians. Back in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul is telling them because of what's coming down the pike, the church is going to be persecuted, people are going to be killed, families are going to be ripped apart. It's better if you don't get married right now. But if you're going to get married for God. If you're going to stay single for God. Paul was single and was able to serve God better because of it. Peter was married and was able to serve as an elder in the church later because he met those qualifications of being married. Paul never could. He was an apostle, he had a totally different role, very important role, but he could never do what Peter could. Peter was able to serve in a different capacity. So whichever way you go, whichever point you're at in your life, whether you're single or you're dating, make sure that you are putting God first and using being single or dating to do what God wants. Does that make sense? Okay. This is a big one, and I want you guys to think about this really hard. Do not start dating until you're at least close to being in a position to consider marriage. If you're 12 and you're not planning on getting married at 14, you shouldn't be worried about dating. And I am really bad about contributing to this idea in people's heads. Because it's easy for me to walk up to someone and be like, hey, Anna, you like any boys? Tell me about, oh, you like a boy. I bet you really like him. If Anna's not in a position to be considering marriage seriously, I should not be pushing Anna to think that she should do something about liking a boy that she likes. If you are 16, you're 16, right? 17, all right. If you're 17 and you're not planning on getting married at 19, let's say, then you probably shouldn't be worrying about dating. And that's hard for us to think about sometimes because everybody, at least when I was in school, everybody that was 17 was dating. And usually in a pretty serious relationship that they'd been together for what seemed like forever, like 6 months or a year or sometimes 2 years, when it seems like forever whenever you're that age. But if you're not close to being in a position to think about marriage seriously, don't worry about dating. Because if you are dating without any chance of being able to be married to the right person, then you have to ask yourself, what is the point of dating? Unless you are willing to commit to a relationship for like 5 years and then be able to be in a position to be married, then you should be thinking about dating. And I'm going to tell you, the vast majority of the relationships where somebody's like, we're not in a position to be married for like another 5 or 8 years, but we're together now, the vast majority of them tank. Something happens along the road and they just split and it falls apart. So it's better off if you wait until you are open to the idea of marriage to start dating. Does that make sense? Just because everybody else does it differently doesn't mean that you as a Christian should do it the same way everybody else does. Okay? Date with a godly marriage is the goal. You read ahead earlier. All right, this is very, very important. Rather than having a checklist of all these things are what I want in a man or a woman, you should be worrying about, can I go to heaven because of this relationship? Will this relationship with this person make it easier for me to go to heaven? And if you cannot answer yes, whenever it comes to thinking about marriage, then you should not marry that person. If it's going to be harder for you to go to heaven by marrying a certain person, you don't need that person. You need God worse than you need that person. And we'll explain why a little bit further down. Never assume or do anything while dating just because it's the way that the world does it. That seems easy, right? But whenever we grow up in an atmosphere of the world doing things around us, oftentimes we take for granted that that's the way we should do things too. Especially whenever it comes to dating. I was reading a series of articles this guy wrote like 2 or 3 weeks ago about dating. And he was a Baptist over in Tennessee, but he said something important. He said, whenever I was young, the only thing I knew about dating was that we shouldn't have sex before we're married. Which is right. But he said that's it. That's all I knew. That was the one rule, is don't have sex before you're married, and that's the only thing I needed to know about dating. And he said that led me down a path of making a series of mistakes, and if it wasn't for a few people giving me unwanted advice at unwanted times, then I would have made even more mistakes while I was dating. So just because we have grown up thinking that something is a certain way, I want you to question that and look at something as seemingly simple as dating from a biblical view, okay? And especially with the idea of, does this help me get to heaven? And if it doesn't, forget that idea and do something different that will fit with God's will. Don't be in such a rush to have a love story that you make a mistake and yoke yourself to someone who will not get you to heaven. I kind of got ahead of myself on this one here. Anybody here listen to Taylor Swift? Old Taylor Swift? Yeah, old Taylor Swift. I don't care for Taylor Swift. You used to be a Taylor Swift fan, right? Yeah, okay. Taylor Swift is always writing stories about falling in love and having just this magical fairy book story of a relationship. Or she's crying her eyes out on her guitar, right? There's no happy middle ground, but if you are raised on Disney movies, like I was, and then you listen to music like that all the time, where everything is sunshine and rainbows, or you are pouring your heart out because your woman left you, that's country music. You grow up with the mindset of, this is what I need to have. And with our age group, it is very easy to want to have things right now. Because if you see somebody with a nice house and a nice car and a nice job, you don't understand that it took 30 or 40 years for that person to get that stuff, but you want to have that right now. We can do that with relationships. And that's hard for us to realize that we're even doing it. So we don't need to be in such a rush to have a Disney fairy book story where everything is perfect and he has the perfect proposal and we ride off into the sunset together, that you make a mistake because you're in such a rush to have that love story. Make sure that you don't make a mistake, because if you marry someone that you shouldn't be married to, then it is going to be harder for you to get to heaven. And let's take a second right now. Everybody knows what the definition of true success is, right? Yeah?
Living your life.
Okay, thank you. All right, it's living your life and going to heaven. I'm glad Jacob is the only one that remembers that, or is at least willing to say.
Yeah.
What is the definition of true success in dating?
Same thing.
Right? It's the exact same. All right, it's dating and going to heaven at the end of dating. Whenever we get to marriage, the definition of success in marriage is being married to someone for life and going to heaven at the end of your life. Preferably with the other person too. But if you want to be successful in dating with that definition of success in mind, if you hook yourself, your cart, to a horse that's going to drag you away from God, then it is going to be so much harder for you to go where you need to go. Do not make that mistake. Do not rush into stuff, and I'll throw this into. Value the advice of trusted Christians. If someone that is a trusted Christian sees you being pulled away from God by someone, then value that person's advice whenever they are willing to tell you that. And cherish that person for being honest with you and caring enough to tell you what they honestly think that is for your own good. Okay. Remember, while dating, there is no such thing as soulmates. I cannot tell you how many marriages I saw get ripped apart while I worked at the hospital. There's like hundreds of marriages to observe up there at the hospital when you work with all those people. I can't tell you how many of them got ripped apart because somebody had a midlife crisis. They would turn 30 or 35 or even sometimes 40, sometimes older. And then they would say, I just don't love my spouse anymore. But this person over here that I work with, I think they're my soulmate. And it's not the person I'm married to, so what am I going to do? I'm going to trash the relationship I've had for 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years and go get into a relationship with the person that I think is my soulmate. The idea of soulmates is a dangerous one. Because if you think that there is one singular person for you, it blinds you to their actual characteristics. If you think that the person you're with is your soulmate, you will do anything to justify their bad traits, their bad habits, their ungodliness even. And I love Elizabeth to the moon and back, but we both know that if one of us gets hit by a train tomorrow, that we can find somebody else that is a Christian, have a successful marriage with that person, and still go to heaven in the end. And if you have that understanding that there's not one singular Prince Charming for you out there, or Snow White or whatever for the boys, then you don't have that attitude of, I have to be with this person because I think they're my soulmate. If you think that there is such a thing as soulmates, find me a Bible passage. Find me a Bible passage anywhere that says there are two people destined to be together forever, and no matter how the stars are aligned, those two people are going to come together no matter what. It's not going to happen. There's not one singular person waiting for you. There is a whole ocean, let's go with that figure of speech, a whole ocean full of fish out there, and you could throw a net, pull up a couple dozen that you could go to heaven with in the whole world. At least, right? Preferably thousands, but in some people's cases, hundreds or dozens. But you can go to heaven with different people. You can't fall into the trap of thinking there's one singular person that's your soulmate. You have to be with that person. Okay. We're going to get into some more detailed, we've been talking about generalities now. Let's get into specific details. I found a person. These are some rules to do if you have a person and you are dating together. Don't be alone together in a house or a room, especially a bedroom. I think the reasons for this are pretty obvious, but let's go to Hebrews 13. This is actually in the back of the bulletin. I about said 5, but it's not 5, it's verse 4. Anna, why don't you read verse 4 for us?
Marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge.
Okay. One of the goals of dating is to remain pure, spiritually and physically, right? If you have those understandings, that understanding in your head, then you need to understand that taking steps to prevent those things from being violated is a good idea. Now you might think in your mind, well, the person I'm with, we would never ever be tempted to do something that we shouldn't do. So it's totally okay if we're home together or if we're in a room together and somebody else is in the house, it's no big thing. But I'm going to tell you a story. Guy I went to school with, and I'm going to have to make better time than this. Guy that I went to school with, whenever he lost his virginity, I'm going to just talk in plain terms since we're all close to legal adults in here. But whenever he lost his virginity, his bedroom door was open, and his parents were in the living room, and his bedroom was joined to the living room. There was like 15, 20 feet between him and his parents whenever that happened, with a door open. And yet he managed to pull that off because that's what he wanted. If you are tempted in a situation where somebody is in the house, but let's say they fall asleep and no one's going to know, or there's no one in the house together at all, either your parents aren't home or you guys are old enough, you have your own place. If you guys are there alone together, you can be tempted to do things that you shouldn't do, especially if you love that person and you have feelings of attraction for that person. It can be very, very easy to do. So it's simpler just to put a rule down right at the beginning of the relationship. I'm never going to be in a room or house alone with you. If you can't handle that, then we probably aren't going to work out anyway, because you're not willing to put God first in the relationship. And if that person isn't willing to have ground rules in place to help you both go to heaven, then that person's not going to help you get to heaven down the road whenever you're married together either. So this is a good ground rule to have right out of the gate. Always be accountable to someone when you go on a date. Alright? That seems silly. And if you spend a lot of time together, let's say you guys are dating, so I'm going to use you as the guinea pig here. Let's say Jacob and Amanda go out 2 or 3 times a week for 6 months. That is roughly 18 times they would have to call someone and be like, hey, we're going on a date. We just want to let you know this is where we're going. This is what time we're going to get there. We're leaving now. This is what time we expect to be back. We're just going to check in with you so we're accountable. And if you have a trusted Christian friend or a parent that is willing to help you meet your goal of going to heaven after dating, then they should be willing to help you with that. Now that might seem like a hassle, especially if you do what I also recommend and update them. Okay, we ate dinner, just letting you know, we have text messages now, that's pretty cool. Like, we take that for granted, but that's pretty cool. We can be like, hey, we just ate dinner, we're going to the movie. Hey, we just left the movie, we're headed home. Should be 15 minutes. If you have that accountability in place, it's essentially a chaperone that isn't there that is going to be able to keep you accountable. Only that chaperone is a Christian. And then you won't be tempted to pull a Bob Seger and slip out into the woods and lose 30 minutes on the way home together. You looked at me really weird when I said that. Does anybody listen to Bob Seger? Bob Seger was on at Jim's party last night for like 15 seconds. And that brings us to the next one. Be very careful about what media you consume while you're together. I'm going to use this example and then I'm going to use a better one, because I had this one in mind and then Elizabeth told me this was a horrible one. If you are driving around on a back road, listening to Bob Seger's Night Moves, where he's talking about parking a car and fornicating in a secluded spot in the backwoods, then it's going to be easier to be tempted to pull off on a back road and fornicate in the backwoods. Does that make sense? Okay. Here's a better one that's much more likely to happen. Let's say you're watching TV together. Because half you guys are looking at me like you don't even know who Bob Seger is. But let's say you're watching TV together and you're watching a show that's PG-13, which is great because you're not watching an R-rated movie, right? Or TV-14 or whatever, and all of a sudden this guy and this girl are like mauling each other, making out and being passionate, showing as much skin as TV will legally allow, and you're sitting there uncomfortable next to the person going, it's not good for you to watch on your own. It's especially not good for you to watch whenever you're with someone that you already have feelings of attraction to and are already somewhat probably tempted to maul their face off. So we need to be careful what we are putting into our heads, especially whenever we are in that company together. I'll throw this into, we should be careful about what we are putting into our heads while we are dating, period, but especially together. Okay. Don't become stumbling blocks to one another by passionately kissing, embracing too closely, or dancing together, and that includes slow dancing. Whenever I was young, I don't know like where this came from, but there was this magical rule that I thought existed where regular dancing was ridiculous, especially because I'm a terrible dancer. But slow dancing is totally okay. But whenever I was older and I got to thinking, if you look at what slow dancing is, you put two people closely together, unless they're doing the whole awkward this thing whenever they're dancing together. You put two people, you embrace them closely, you put your hands on your hips and up on the shoulders, and then you're sitting there swaying together. I don't have to pretend to explain to you guys what that is simulating to a slight degree, right? Anytime you put two people, especially close together, they have feelings of attraction, you are most likely, maybe you're that magical 1 in a million person, but it's most likely going to lead to feelings of arousal in that other person, and you can become a stumbling block very easy. Okay? I'm going to ask you guys this. If you are in a relationship where you both want to serve God, you both want to go to heaven, and you never actually fornicate, but you guys are lusting and fornicating in your minds, have you succeeded in your goal? No. Because even though you haven't committed the physical act, if that sin is present in your mind, even though you haven't followed through on the physical act, you have still sinned. Does that make sense? Okay. So the key is to prevent that from ever happening. So avoid mauling their face off with kisses. Avoid getting too close together. Even avoid dancing together slowly. And that's something that is hard for us to think about because everybody else does it. Everybody knows that even in people that aren't going to sleep together in the world, there is a set course that a person goes on while they're dating. First you hold hands together if you're really conservative, and then you kiss, and then you have better kisses, and then you guys end up being closer than one living organism. You have two organisms put together that are together forever until they finally get married. But that's not what we see in the Bible, how Christians are supposed to act toward one another. So even though you may have never thought about this before, snuggling up too close to somebody cannot leave room for Jesus, if that makes sense. I used to laugh at that so hard because in my college dorm, girls weren't allowed to go back past a certain point at C of O. But girls could be in the common room. So you'd have a boyfriend and a girlfriend that didn't have anywhere else to go because probably their cars were locked up in the freshman parking lot. And they would be snuggled up together on a couch, just, I mean, as close as, you can't see this other person, but I mean as close could be, right? I mean, they were snuggled up tight. The RAs would walk through, and if they were too close, he would yell from across the room, different ones, I love this, leave room for Jesus. And everybody would go, and look at those people, and they'd be like, there's a gap now. And that's a funny saying, and it's a funny story, and I used to love thinking about that. But you need to leave room for Jesus in your expressions of affection toward one another until you're married. Does that make sense? Okay. Even though everybody else does it, even though you may have never thought about it before, even though other people in the church may have done it growing up whenever they were young, doesn't mean that you should do it. Make sense? Don't ever, I put never, ever, ever, but don't ever sin because the person you were dating pressured you to sin. If that person that is pressuring you to sin in any way, whether it be alcohol, fornication, lusting, not willing to respect the ground rules that you're trying to put in place to keep yourself pure physically and spiritually, if they are pressuring you to sin, if they are not willing to repent, dump them as fast as you possibly can. You cannot get rid of them fast enough if they are not willing to help you go to heaven. Because if they won't do it now, they won't do it later. And no human being on the face of the planet is worth going to hell for. I threw one of my favorite Bible verses in there too. Remember that the world's definition of love is not the same as God's definition of love. If you love someone, make sure that it's according to God's will. Make sure that it's a biblical definition of love and not a Disney storybook, Taylor Swift song kind of love. And one last time, again, if you're single or dating, make sure that you're living for God. Whether you have someone that you're interested in marrying, or you're trying to get someone interested in marrying you, or you're just single, be willing to do what God wants and everything. Does anybody have any questions? Okay. Thank you.